Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan MSP. This is Ukraine War Frontline update for the 26th of January 2024. If you don't know what the lines on my map mean, please check out the key on the video at the moment. Let's go to that northeastern axis from Kupyansk to Svatovo to Crimea, and as you can see, none of my mappers, or the mappers I refer to, are indicating any changes to the front line until we get down to this Terny area going towards, from Crimea towards the west. We're going to pop into the Institute for the Study of War. Spokesperson for the Ukrainian unit, that's the American military think tank, a Ukrainian unit operating in Kupyansk Liman direction, stated that the Russian forces continue conducting attacks with infantry groups of up to 20 personnel and unspecified mechanized support, and that the intensity of Russian artillery fire in the area has almost doubled in the past day. So something ticking up in that area. The Ukrainian spokesperson stated that Russian forces are conducting personnel rotations almost weekly, but that there is no noticeable increase in the number of Russian personnel in the area. Now, this is a worry. Previously, there have been widespread complaints that the Russians are unable to rotate because they just don't have the strength and depth. They don't have the reserves to do that. And the Russians have been attrited at a rate whereby they are recruiting. Now, if they are able to do successive rotations in this area, it means that they have enough troops to be able to do that. They are able to rotate, which means that the troops are fresh here, and they're not being attrited at the required rate, perhaps in this area alone. Perhaps that is something that's happening up and down the front line, but it's worthy of note. A Russian source claimed that Ukrainian minefields are complicating Russian offensive operations near Avdiivka, and that's in this area there. Okay, we're going to pop into what Deep State Maps has suggested, just some small Ukrainian gains on the way towards Zaporizhzhia and Terny there. I don't know that that's particularly significant, but a small gain. It's always nice when we see the bright yellow or blue pins, and indeed where there are some blue pins and bright yellow pins on the map. So it's just an interesting time at the moment, because you'd expect the Russians to be having success most of the places on the front line, but the Ukrainians are managing to keep up the pressure in certain areas. Here, as according to Syriac Maps, no individual tweeting out from Syriac Maps, just changes to their mapping, and thanks to JR who's done the mapping today. What a ledge. So here we have the Russians making some gains to the north. They've made some gains to the northeast previously. That is a little bit worrying in terms of, you know, the different directions that they're coming at Avdiivka from, and they're having success closing it in, you know, turning it into something of a cauldron, perhaps, if they can get further across. But the challenges they will have is just getting across this river, the Seversky Donetsk River, you know, because at the end of the day, well, let's go and have a look at this. So if you look here on the right, which is to the south, you have the Ukrainian control in these mountains, and they are higher than it looks there. There's a fairly significant topography to deal with there, and down here in the forests, not only do the Russians have to gain through there and navigate over meandering rivers back further in the forest, and you can see that here, this will be challenging already, and this is fairly hilly ground here, but then they have to, you know, get down into this river and then up onto the mountains. It's just a really difficult thing for them to do, especially without significant mechanized equipment, because they'll be coming through the forest and then crossing a river. We've already seen what happened to them at Balaklaya, where they lost perhaps 100 pieces of kit trying to cross the Seversky Donetsk River. They have not had as much success historically during this war in doing so. So, yeah, that is something in the Ukrainians' favor to the north there. And as we come around to the east, there is also, you know, problematic physical relief for them to navigate as well. So it's a difficult area for either side to make many advances. And then there's no change to the Bakhmut lines, as we can see here. As we come further to the south, look, just positional fighting. We're going to pop into a different source, Getty, that says summary for the morning of January 26th. So in the Kupyansk Liman direction, where we've just been looking, the forces have repelled attacks from Russian troops north of Sinkivka, so that's right up the north by Kupyansk, and in the Krakmalny area in the eastern part of Latveia and Serebyansky Forest. No significant changes. So there's some gains somewhere along the front line, not really specified there. It could be a little push back in the Krakmalny area where the Russians have made some gains. It could be some counterattacks, not sure. And then really we come down past Bakhmut now to Avdiivka, where most of the activity is taking place. This is the most serious place on the front line, I would have thought. Anyway, as we come down there, Getty says in the Seversk direction, the Russians continue to try to find a gap in the defenses of the armed forces of Ukraine, northeast and southeast of Belorivka. In the area of Sperny and Vasily, no significant changes. Now, in the Avdiivka direction, there are heavy battles in the southern part of the city along Sobornaya, Sportivnaya, and Chernyshevsky streets, all as well as to the west and southwest of Tsar's Hunt complex, and we'll look at that in a second. That's the Tsarska Ochota area. The situation remains dynamic. Ukraine Defense Force has repelled attacks northeast of Berdichi in the Stepova area and in Pervomaisky. Okay, so that is to say there are repelled attacks in Pervomaisky in the Berdichi area to the north, but most of the activity is concerned with what's taking place around the dachas in the south. Now, who would have thunk it? It turns out that Suryat Maps is indeed, we've signposted it as minor Ukrainian gains. I don't think it is. I think it's starting to admit that Zenit probably wasn't taken by the Russians, and we're starting to see that roll back. So it was sort of up here. Now that's being rolled back. I would imagine that might be pushed back further. It seems to me that Zenit is under control of the Ukrainians, and that the Russians didn't take that, and that would be a real problem for the Ukrainians if they did. However, the Russians are making gains, as according to two of the mappers here, Andrew Perpetua and Suryat Maps, in this southern Dacha area, expanding this bridgehead and also pushing out further, so that Andrew Perpetua is starting to agree more with Suryat Maps as to how far into those Dachas the Russians have made it. As according to the ISW, Russian forces recently advanced north of Avdiivka and on Avdiivka's southern outskirts, and Ukrainian forces reportedly recently made marginal gains south of the settlement. So geolocated footage published on January the 25th indicates that Russian forces recently advanced southwest of Stepova and along Sportivna Street in the southernmost residential area of Avdiivka. Now, I can't quite work out the geolocation of one of these that they're talking about, which is the one I would have thought to the north here, which is Stepova. There's some video footage of some activity taking place there. Fighters of the 49th OMBR showed a spectacular work on the destruction of Russians on the eastern outskirts of Stepova. The Russian enemy continues to occupy the village, conducts assaults almost every day, but without success, thanks to the effective work of the defense forces. Now, this could indicate that the Russians actually do control much of Stepova. So it could be that video indicates some Russian gains there. It's tough to work out just looking at that video exactly what is going on in any individual place. It seems to be highly contested still, that area. And then when we come to the south, we do have a geolocation. Tanks of the 116th Mechanized Brigade work on Russian positions in the southern part of Avdiivka, Donetsk region, and that is geolocated to here. So see, this is working on Russian positions. So these are Russian positions. We'll see what the geolocation tells us. Right, so that is really confirming what Suryat Maps is claiming there. So the Ukraine is working on the Russian positions in that area. The furthest extent of the Russian gains, as according to Suryat Maps. So that is fairly significant, and that would indicate that the Russians are having, as we believe, quite a bit of success in this area. There was talk, and I discussed this yesterday, that the Russians were using tunnels, or actually more accurately sewers and drain pipes, larger drain pipes, to get down and then pop up behind the Ukrainians, and that they've been using that to some effect there. So anyway, moving on now further to the south, there really isn't an awful lot more to report. In terms of different sources, there's some Suryat map changes to the mapping just south east of Pobyeda and on the way to Novomerkylivka. We have some Ukrainian gains and then minor Russian gains, so a bit of both in that area, but I don't have any details about that. As I say, no tweeting concerning individual changes as we'd normally expect from Suryat maps, so I don't know if they're just particularly busy at the moment, something personal or whatever, but they're just doing the mapping changes. And then here's some gains for the Ukrainians further to the south of Novomerkylivka along this whole stretch that Andrew Perpetua changed recently, changed all of that, although the bit up to this white line, or up to the road really, had been, he said, probably a long time before. I think he was talking June, July time, and he had just found evidence to support the control of that area. But this area here is what the Russians had taken, and then we see that either Suryat Maps has walked their previous gains back a bit, or the Ukrainians have counterattacked. It's quite difficult to tell with Suryat Maps. It's quite often just walking back overconfident original claims, and that's why when there are these big claims of Russian gains that are made, I have to add the caveat that it could well be a little bit over optimistic. Anyway, oh god, I interrupted myself, didn't I? And I was still back in the ISW in Avdiivka. Anyway, the claims back there is that they're using a variety of tactics, 10 assaults over the previous day with a variety of tactics used. But this is just a more of a general kind of claim about Avdiivka. I will read it to you. Russian forces appear to be preparing to fight their way through Avdiivka after failing to encircle the settlement. Russian forces have recently focused offensive operations on the southern residential area of Avdiivka and have made marginal gains there. Russian forces are still attacking against Avdiivka's northern and southern flanks, but the tempo is far below the scale of the initial waves of Russian mechanized assaults on Avdiivka's flank in sort of October and November 2023. The overall tempo of Russian offensive operations suggests that Russian forces have prioritized fighting through Avdiivka block by block from the town's southeastern residential area instead of trying to further encircle the settlement from further southwest or to the north, where Russian forces have made only limited gains. Russian forces may seek to replicate attritional light infantry frontal assaults to make tactical gains by brute force, as Russian forces did during the battles of Bakhmut after breaching Bakhmut city limits. Ukrainian Ministry of Internal Affairs Major Maxim Morozov stated on January the 25th that Russian forces have accumulated 40,000 personnel near Avdiivka and are preparing to intensify operations against the city there. It is unclear if the rate of Russian advance in Avdiivka will increase substantially. Future combat in the city will likely resemble recent instances of urban warfare in eastern Ukraine, wherein Russian forces conduct attritional assaults for marginal gains. Ukraine's hypothetical loss of Avdiivka would not threaten to unhinge Ukraine's defense of Donetsk, even if Russian forces eventually manage to make costly tactical gains in the town over the coming months. Okay, sorry to flip back and some forwards, but actually let's just remind ourselves of the context and put that on the map. So this is that the Russians are trying to fight through Avdiivka because they have been not successful enough in taking territory to the north and to the south. I've explained before that the coke plant here was the key, and if the Ukrainians lost the coke plant, they would lose Avdiivka, but they've kept hold of that. The heights there of the buildings, I mean, I'd love to show you on 3D, but it won't pick up the buildings, give them a real advantage in stopping the Russians moving anywhere forward in this northern area. They have been having success north by Vesely here, this Vesely, and moving towards the quarry lake here, and some success south of Kamyanka as well. So that's a worry. But again, it's more open land there. And then north of the coke plant around Stepova, they've been halted in their advances along the railway line, which is good news for the Ukrainians, and around Stepova. So the Russians have been unable really to continue their advances to encircle the city. So, realistically, they'd like to get around there, close that neck, or get through and then down into here and interdict this road as it comes into the west of Avdiivka. So they've been unable to do that, and they've been unable to advance from the south because this area of land is so flat, and they just get absolutely hammered by ATGM crews and mortars and artillery. And where I was saying before that really they would want to surround the city because it will mean that they won't have to fight house to house, and you would then force the Ukrainians to pull out through the cauldron's neck as quickly as they could. Now it appears that they're going to fight through the city and probably use the same tactics we saw in Bakhmut. Now, this does look bad for the Ukrainians still. What the Ukrainians do now is going to be interesting because the Russians are in Avdiivka, and kind of like a disease, you want to cut that flesh out. You want to amputate your leg, or you got to cure it somehow. How do you get rid of this that's festering there? And that requires a counterattack. In all seriousness, in reality, that's not probably going to happen at the moment with the lack of resources and the lack of personnel. So it's looking bad for for Avdiivka. The question is just how long will that take? I mean, we saw how long it took for the Russians to take Bakhmut. Is it going to be the same for Avdiivka? Right. Sorry to have flipped all the way back to there. And then concerning Novomikhailivka, the ISW says that Ukrainian forces recently advanced 500 meters, to 1.5 kilometers along a section of the front line south of there. But the ISW says there's no confirmation. That's probably going to be this area that we see there. So good news for the Ukrainians there. Right, now, bypassing Velika Novosilka, where it's positional, and indeed when we get to the ISW, the claims of it being positional pretty much around Robotine is what's been claimed. The ISW has not observed recent changes to the front line around there. However, Deep State Map has some gains for the Ukrainians in an area north of Verbove, which is obviously good news for the Ukrainians, between Verbove and Novopokrovka. So the Ukrainians are still committing to some maneuvers and some movements in that area, which always surprises me, given that they are, I suppose that's active defense, which is where there is a vulnerability, where you get some good intel, then you push and probe and prod and have some successes on occasion. And then Krinky, no changes to my mapping sources in that area. It is worth noting that a reassessment of the situation in Krinky after weeks of silence about progress from either side. Says no reports Russians have managed to take back some area in the center over the last weeks, but the situation remains dynamic. Weather circumstances make it hard for both sides, and that is probably just sort of confirming what we already had in place in terms of some gains over in this area. Just speaking to sources around here, it is difficult. The boats are still getting stuck on ice on the river, and that then means that they are easy prey, and they're still losing boats. And when you lose boats, you lose people, whether they're injured people trying to get back or fresh troops with supplies trying to get across. It's going to be, I'm sure there'll be no empty boats. It's a bit like cargo in a haulage on the roads in whatever country you're in. You don't want to ever have an empty lorry going somewhere, because that's just a waste of resources, a waste of money. Well, in this case, it's a waste of time and effort in getting those boats across the river. So if you're going across the river, you're not going to have an empty boat. You're going to be taking supplies. And if you're coming back from Krinky, you are going to be bringing injured soldiers and other bits and pieces that need fixing or whatever. So I'm sure there's never going to be an empty boat. So any boat that you see on a lost list on a daily basis, there's going to be someone and something in it, and it's not going to be easy for the Ukrainians there. So we know that they are losing troops on those boats on a daily basis. Right, challenging, but still, one must argue, worth it for the Ukrainians, even given that. Okay, it's a horrific calculus, isn't it, when you are having to talk about the death of people in exchange for more deaths of the other people. That's a Frontline. Please like, subscribe and share. Really appreciate all your support. My next video is going to be one concerning a certain DJT. It is on US politics. It's concerning a speech that has just come out, a kind of manifesto of 10 points he's made, which is entirely dictatorial, and one of the most worrying things I've heard a US politician say in a long time. But I just couldn't not make a commentary on it. I saw it this morning and it just blew my mind, and so I had to do a video on that. So that's coming next. If you don't like that kind of divisive political subject matter, then obviously steer clear. Thanks so much. Take care. Toodle pips.